Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by a head performance coach of the Boston Bruins, Kevin Neeld. Kevin is the head performance coach for the Boston Bruins, where he oversees all aspects of designing and implementing the team's performance training program, as well as monitoring the players' performance, workload, and recovery. Prior to Boston, Kevin spent 2 years as an assistant strength and conditioning coach for the San Jose Sharks and 7 years as a director of programming and performance for a private facility in New Jersey. He also had a 5-year stint with the U.S. Women's Olympic ice hockey team. Kevin is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and licensed massage therapist holding a master's degree in kinesiology and exercise neuroscience from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a bachelor's degree in health behavior science and fitness management with a minor in strength and conditioning from the University of Delaware. He recently completed his doctoral degree in Rocky Mountain University's Human and Sport Performance program. A fantastic episode with Kevin. We talk about the contrast between the public or the private sector and the National Hockey League. We talked about his 2 years in San Jose with Mike Potenza and how it helped him in his current role as the head performance coach for the Boston Bruins. We also chat about his PhD journey, specifically 2 articles that were published on external workload and the applications from a practical standpoint that we can garner from these. It's a fantastic episode. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while since you and I spoke last, at least live in person. I think last time I saw you was in Columbus when the Blue Jackets when Boston was making a Columbus swing. But it's great to have you on. I know it's going to be an exciting hour at the onset. Probably one of the smartest guys that I've had the opportunity to learn from in hockey. You having the chance of both working with you on the women's national team and then just learning from you, whether it's online and your social media, whether it's personal conversations. It's going to be a treat for the listeners. I want to start a little bit before your National Hockey League days. You spent 7 years in the private sector, okay? And then you gradually went to the National Hockey League, 2 years as an assistant strength coach, okay? San Jose Sharks under Mike Potenza. Contrast the private sector for me, if you would, to your first few years in San Jose. Big differences?
Yeah, I think there's some pretty notable differences there. I mean, our programs at Endeavor, where I was in the private sector for 7 years, evolved over time. And I think where we were towards the end is most of our business was kind of under this semi-private training model where an athlete would come in, they would go through some assessment that half could fall under this umbrella of movement screening. The other half could fall under the umbrella of performance testing. And then, based on that athlete's goals, based on what we found through that screening process, based on our timeline, the sport they played, their age, their gender, injury history, all those things, we would custom design a program for them and then take them through that in a small group setting where most of the athletes were on totally different programs. And
sure.
I think that when I made the transition to San Jose, the time that you have available to run some of those screening processes, to implement a training intervention in season is different. So
sure.
I think the thing that really helped me coming from Endeavor into San Jose is that the athletes kind of roll in as the morning goes on. The guys with kids tend to come in a little bit earlier than the guys without kids. And because of that, you get this, maybe 30 to 45 minute window where athletes are coming in to start whatever we had planned for them that day. And that was very similar to how Endeavor was. So I felt really comfortable, taking somebody through a couple things on a warm up, then transitioning my attention to somebody else that maybe is in the middle of a lift and just kind of rotating around the room and making sure that everybody got the attention that they needed at the right time. I think a lot of the program adjustments that Mike Potenza and I made for individual athletes in San Jose, I felt really comfortable with because it was very similar to what we did at Endeavor. Yep. There was more of that kind of individualized approach to the training process. The logistical barriers are real, and those are things that obviously play a factor in designing programs at the NHL level, but I think the philosophy and the approach was very similar. So different athlete population, in general, older, at the time, my first year in San Jose, I think we had the third oldest roster in the league.
Wow.
We had Joe Thornton, Patrick Marleau, Joel Ward, Paul Martin, Joe Pavelski, Brent Burns. All of those guys were over 30 when I was there, a couple over 35. So we didn't see a ton of that at Endeavor from a competitive athlete standpoint. But yeah, so I think that there was a lot of differences that Mike really helped me navigate early on, but a lot of similarities as far as kind of the workflow of guys coming in and, how we could find ways to display the program so that they were getting what they needed, but it wasn't overly cumbersome for the athlete.
So you spent 2 years after you got out of Endeavor, you spent 2 years San Jose Sharks with Mike Potenza. Your current role now, head of performance for the Boston Bruins. How do you feel that 2 years set you up to hand off and now be the head of performance for Boston? What were those years like under Mike? I'm guessing it was obviously a learning process from an environment, from logistics, could you walk us through how that prepared you for your current job?
Yeah. I think my first year in San Jose was Mike's 11th in San Jose. So
going on 17 now, right?
Yeah, exactly. So he obviously had a system in place there, a well-deserved respect through the organization. He had spent, a decade really expanding his role and his reach within the organization from, being involved in development camp presentations to scouting meetings after the combine and before the NHL draft, overseeing the AHL program. So, Mike and I had known each other for 10 years before I took that position and had the opportunity to work with him. So he knew, I think, that my aspirations were to do the best job that I could in San Jose, but also, when the time was right to grow and take the next step and to pursue a head job. So he was really purposeful in including me in a lot of things that he didn't need to include me in. I was involved in some coaches meetings early on, some of the harder conversations with individual players. I had some exposure to that, as you, Sarah, and I did with Mike Boyle and USA Hockey too. I think that being able to sit in and see how people that have been around for a long time approach those conversations it was helpful for me in both instances.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right out of the gate, Mike and I kind of tag team the NHL combine data processing and the presentation to the scouting staff there. So maybe a long-winded way of saying that when I made the transition to Boston, I felt that what Mike had exposed me to in San Jose prepared me really well for that. There weren't a lot of elements to the job that I didn't have some level of exposure, if not experience in heading into Boston. But then, you walk into a new organization with different athletes, different personalities, different culture, management, scouts, head coach, their systems and philosophies are different organization to organization. So all of that is a learning curve, I think, anytime you start a new job. But, I felt prepared to handle those challenges as they came and as they continue to come now.
Fantastic. Your current appointment right now, again, head performance for the Boston Bruins. What does a typical day look like for you? Who reports to you, and then who do you report to?
Sure. So there's in season, there's kind of two template typical days. One's a practice day and one's a game day. Practice days, we typically try to get in pretty early to beat traffic and get a workout in before the day really gets going. So I'm typically
and the arms are looking pretty good right now, man. I got to be honest with you. You've been doing some extra curls there.
I think my wife put the polo on the high setting in the dryer last week. So that may be.
I love it. The schmedium? You're wearing the schmedium?
Yeah, that's it. I think it was a small before, and now it's an extra small.
Sorry, I cut your train of thought off. You're talking about a practice day and a game day. You were talking about practice days. My apologies.
Sure, that's okay. No days without an arm day. That's right. That's the philosophy at this stage of life. But so we're typically in between 6:30 and 7. Try to get a quick workout in, grab breakfast, and then start setting up for the day. Setting up for the day entails quick review with our medical staff about where players are. Obviously injured players, where they are, what's planned for them in that current day. We kind of review timelines, what's coming up in the next several days, couple weeks for the longer term cases. Anything from our end, from a on-ice workload standpoint, anything we're noticing from a fatigue and recovery, soreness standpoint, we try to just make sure that there's no surprises internally within the support staff, that we're on the same page there. There's a little bit of legwork to get set up with. We're fortunate to have Catapult. We have heart rate monitors as well. So getting that stuff all programmed and set up for the day. And then our players, there will be some segment of our players that train almost every day. So when I say that, I don't mean that one player will train 7 days a week, but the way that we have kind of designed and facilitate our training process throughout the year is that there are certain days that the whole team will train. There are certain days that a segment of certain players in certain situations will train. And then based on what they did, maybe the next day we're trying to fill some gaps with some of the remaining players. So, I'll sit down with my assistant, Tim Labassiere, and, kind of go over some quickly, what have guys done? What do guys need for today? What do we have lined up? Are we looking to, take some guys that maybe don't feel great coming off of a day off and just give them something quick to get the engine back revved up before a game day. So we have that quick review period internally in the morning too, and then, design whatever we have planned for that day. And then sometime between 9 and 9:30, players start rolling into the gym. So, we'll practice day. We're typically on the ice at 11 or 11:30. We'll go through whatever training before with most guys. Some guys will come off the ice afterwards and train. Then we kind of pack up, clean up, and you're out the door by 2 to 3 o'clock, depending on the day. On game days, the mornings are really similar because the guys will come in to either do something in the gym or morning skate in the mornings. They have meetings at the rink as well. We typically get out of there 12:30 or so. I'll drive. I live about a half hour away from our practice rink, so I'll head home, take the dog for a quick walk, basically change, and then get in the car and drive to our game rink by 4. Players start to roll in around 4:30 or so. Same deal. Everybody has their different pregame warm-up routines. Some guys will start really early. Some guys kind of come in later and consolidate it, but go through that pregame warm-up, game 7:30, get out of there. Sometimes we work out after games as well. Pack up, clean up, and then home by 11:30, midnight, some of those days. So that's kind of the general template. Mixed within that, there's some day-to-day fluctuations as far as what's required from a data processing and management standpoint. We build a lot of testing into our training process. So on days where we're collecting some sort of data, after we get all the players through that, we'll spend some time between Tim and I just entering that data into our database and quickly processing it, trying to make sense of where guys are trending, if there's anything we need to navigate from a training standpoint. And then, sometimes there's some conversations that need to be had too on either end of the spectrum. Sometimes guys are wired to do a little too much and need to dial back or change where they're putting their efforts into. And sometimes guys need a little bit of a push. So
2 follow-up questions. One on practice day. You get there early, you go over the workload numbers, you go over the injury profiles. You use the word support staff. Is it just you and Tim, or are you meeting with PTs, ATs, the entire support staff all in one room?
Yeah, we try to meet with our medical staff. So we have a large group this year. It's a little bit of a transitional year for us, but we have several PTs, one of which is also an athletic trainer. And then we have several athletic trainers as well. So everybody's roles are a little bit different there in how they divide up their responsibilities. But the important thing is that the people that are there that need to convey information relevant to their role. So, we have, like most organizations, we have a medical personnel whose responsibility it is to navigate the COVID testing and exits and returns for those players. We have a PT that stays back and handles some of the longer term rehab cases. So, depending on what the updates are, obviously we make sure those people are in the room. And then from our standpoint, we'll communicate big picture things from a workload standpoint. When I say red flags, anything that's a red flag to me is just something that warrants attention. With guys coming back from injuries, guys that are playing through things, you have an opportunity to look at some things and just make sure that what they're doing is in line with what we would want them to do. And if not, is this something too much volume? Is this something that I can handle as far as making certain recovery recommendations? If there are, asymmetries that are presenting themselves, guy blocks a shot, takes a puck off the foot, swollen foot, do we notice anything in how that's changing their skating asymmetries on the ice, which might be more of a medical recommendation. So we try to communicate those things and then also provide some information on what we have planned from a training standpoint. So if anything came up late the night before or overnight, sometimes we have an opportunity to just check to make sure that what we have planned for a player is at least not medically inappropriate, if that's a fair way to say it.
Makes plenty of sense. Also spoke on game day about, different pregame warm-ups, et cetera. How much leniency, and I'm sure it's culturally dependent, right? Teams are different. How much leniency or flexibility do you allow, or is it allowed, period, for example, vets or, other players wanting to do a little bit of their own thing, for lack of a better word?
Sure.
Or is it just a Bruins program, or are you able to work? How does that work?
Yeah. So for us, I'll just take a step back and say that on practice days, every practice day, we have a warm up that we have all the players go through. So our group, and this starts with our leaders, I think that they come in and they go through exactly what's there every day. So, most of the other guys consistently fall in line with that as well. We have some individual guys that on different days will mix in some of their own work. I think one of the things that I've noticed, and I'll tie this back into the game day prep as well, but one of the things that I've noticed is that we have made a consistent effort over my time here to make sure that we're addressing certain buckets of qualities throughout our warm-up process, but then within those, cycling through different exercises that can help address those. So, thoracic spine mobility, for example, we'll have 5 or 6 different variations at a minimum that specifically address that, let alone tying that into some other hip mobility exercises that we do as well. So one of the things that I've noticed is that even when players start to venture off and either add things on their own, or, maybe on a certain day, they are going through a routine that is more specific to what they feel like they need on that day, it seems like they are predominantly picking from the things that have appeared in our warm-ups at different times, which for me, it's, I try not to lose the intent and the purpose of that process. If I have a sideline T-spine mobility exercise and somebody wants to do a half kneeling T-spine rotation exercise, are we still getting what we want, even if it's not exactly what's written on the board on that given day? And, 99 times out of 100, it is. The players are, maybe have some things that they feel really caters to how they're feeling on that day. Well, so they'll integrate those into their process. And again, typically that's in addition to what we're asking of them on practice days. But circling back to your question on game days, my philosophy on game days is we have before morning skate, we'll have a warm-up prepared. Before the game, we have a warm-up prepared. But that time's theirs. It's up to the players to do what they feel like they need to do to best prepare them for the game. And, we do see that there's still a handful of players that at night before the games will, go kick the soccer ball around for a little bit, maybe jog down the hallway and then put their gear on and go. Most of our group will piece together some variations of things that we've done as a group in the past. So, again, I think that on game days, they're afforded the leniency until it's clear that it's not working.
Sure.
And I think that our group, one of the things that I really enjoy and appreciate about how fortunate I am to be involved with a group with this type of culture is that a lot of times if they don't feel good on game nights, they'll come to me. It's not a situation where I have to seek out a lot of guys and say, hey, maybe, sitting on your ass in the locker room for 20 minutes with your headphones on isn't the best way to prepare for the game. Usually guys will say like, hey, I haven't felt good the last couple of days. Do you have any recommendations on things that I can try? And, there's such a wide variety of what players will gravitate to pregame on different days. Some players lift before the game. Some players sprint. A lot of guys will go through some combination of sprinting, jumping, low volume lifting on top of mobility and core activation and dynamic warm up routine. So, I think there's obviously a lot of different ways to help a player transition into that state. And, the key is getting to know the player, find what makes them tick, find what they feel like they need. Also, if players are lifting pregame, how can we put that into the bigger picture of what they've done the day before, what we may have planned post game, what we have planned the next day and those sorts of things. So,
fantastic.
Again, I'm famous for long answers to short questions, but hopefully
it's great. A lot of meat to chew on there, Kev. Thank you. I want to pivot. Teacher, scholar, coach, I all three, PhD, relatively recently, Rocky Mountain University. Wow. First of all, congratulations, because golly, that's a process. Aside from the time commitment, what were several of the challenges that you went through on this journey? I'd imagine, you're a full-time performance coach in the National Hockey League. You're pursuing a PhD. I'd imagine that's a lot in terms and measures of volume. How did you navigate that? Was it overwhelming at times?
Yeah. So I started that process in 2015, and I was still at Endeavor actually for the first couple of years that I started the PhD. And, that had its own challenges. We were typically in the building early there and then got home after dinner time, 8, 9 o'clock. So, early on time was the biggest challenge, I think, was just stepping into this academic world. And, there's now weekly assignments, there's reading material that you have to navigate. There were, because it was a mostly remote program, there were discussion boards that you had to participate in. And, I think getting a sense of what the weekly workload was like, and then learning how to, fit that into the work schedule without compromising the job that we were doing at Endeavor. And, there were several stretches. A lot of the semester started off pretty front heavy with reading. So there were several weeks where I would just wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning every day, read for 2-3 hours, and then go to work, and then we'd have a break around midday where typically we'd work out. So, the workouts got a little shorter during that stretch, and you just keep chipping away at the reading. So, I think the scheduling side of it was a little challenging early on. The message board idea and learning how to constructively communicate and take other people's comments without the context of the face-to-face. It's like, is
challenging at times.
Is that person being a dick, or did they really just want to provide helpful comments? So there was a learning curve, I think, to the remote learning and to the online process as well. But throughout my PhD process, when I started, it was just Emily and I and the dog at the house. So we had no kids in the house. And then, the San Jose opportunity came up. So we moved across the country. Emily was pregnant at the time. A year in, our son Cam was born. Another year later, we moved back across the country to Boston. So, I think that the challenge is just constantly evolved in one that was really specific to the actual PhD process is that it culminates with a dissertation. So the whole time that you're involved with the didactic coursework early on, my brain's going on, what do I want to pursue as an actual dissertation project? And not only, what questions do I want to attempt to shed some light on, but what data will I have the ability to collect? It's a big thing. It doesn't matter what you want to do if you can't have access to that data. So
real quick, such an important lesson that I don't know. I just went through it as a fellow PhD student. You get these grand ideas, and if you're not able to collect it, it's a challenge big time.
Yeah. And I think when I started at Endeavor, I had a list of questions that I thought would be interesting. I thought they would add to the body of literature within our field. And I thought I would have the ability to collect with our, kind of built-in clientele base there. We had a youth hockey organization that we trained all the kids in. So there were some different ideas that I had then. And then you move out to San Jose and all those go out the window. So trying to process that along with all the the lifestyle and the occupation changes were it was a challenge for sure. But I think in the end, where it helped me grow, I think I landed in an area of research that I was equally interested in is where I started and what some of my early ideas were. So, it all worked out in the end.
Speaking of your PhD, so there's a couple papers I want to chat with you about. It spawned obviously the data that you had procured. Differences in external workload demands between session types and positions in collegiate men's ice hockey, published in the International Journal of Kinesiology, 2021, recent article. So the concepts of internal and external training load, I'm reading this verbatim, by the way. This is from a Impellizzeri paper, were first presented at the 8th Annual Congress of the European College of Sports Science in Salzburg, Austria. So this is 2003, so it's relatively new, we'd say. My first question for you is, how would you define internal and external workload? So what's an internal workload? And again, we're dealing with high performance practitioners here on the podcast, but there are some that may not know those differences, or there might be some in totally different fields.
Sure. Yeah. I think the most simplistic way to describe internal and external loads is that external load is what the athlete does and internal load is how they respond to it. So, external loads can include things like distances traveled, speeds hit, time spent in different speed zones, different acceleration and deceleration parameters, asymmetries in those measures, force outputs, all of those that weight lifted, all of those things can fall under the umbrella of external workload monitoring. Internal workload, there's kind of two broad categories there. One is the actual physiological response. So, I think the most typical observation method used is heart rate. So, sure. What's the heart rate response to what the athlete's doing? There are other ones, sweat rates, breathing frequency, O2 saturation. You can get pretty deep down the physiology rabbit hole there. The other category is the psychological response. So how did the athlete perceive the workload or the work that they just went through? And, I think all of those measures have merit, and all of them in different scenarios have been used to longitudinally track if an athlete is performing in a appropriate amount of work, too much, too little, and to start to answer some basic questions there. Obviously, there's been a lot of attention paid to how all of those measures across the categories relate to injury incidents. I think there's at the end of the day, there's also a cost, whether that's financial, which is significant in a lot of cases, or even just the time and resource cost, the burden on the athletes, the analysis from the staff. There's a cost to all of them. I think from my perspective, if you're only looking at internal load, you're acknowledging the body's response to a workload that you're not measuring. And the analogy that I use is, if you know that, and I'll contradict myself a little bit here because at least in one instance, we know what the athlete's doing in this example. But if an athlete goes out and runs a mile and their average heart rate was 160, and then they go a week later or 2 months later, whatever the case is, and they run a mile and their average heart rate's 170, you have no idea what that means if you don't know how fast they ran the mile. So did they run the mile faster and that's why their heart rate is elevated? That may lead you into one interpretation of that information. Did they run it at the exact same speed and their heart rate was higher? That might lead you to a different interpretation. Did they run it slower and their heart rate was higher? That would lead you to a different interpretation. So, if all you have is that heart rate response, it's a little challenging to know what to do with that information. And, the thing we always joke about in hockey is, if you have a really high TRIMP, which is the cumulative total workload output measure of heart rate, if you have a really high TRIMP following a practice and you're playing well, then, in the coach's eyes, you're a hard worker. If you're not playing well, you have a really high heart rate because you're out of shape. And the same number,
different narrative, right?
Exactly. And it's really contingent upon which way the coach wants to go with that information. And look, there's an element of interpretation that can be massaged one way or another with all data. But
sure,
I think that one in particular is really easy to say, like, that guy had a bad game, it's because he's out of shape, or that guy had a good game, look how hard he's working in practice. And because of that, I personally would rather start with, what are they actually doing? And then if you can layer on the heart rate response to that, then I think it's extremely valuable, because now you have what they did and the physiological response to it. And then a lot of the subjective psychological components, at least in this setting, we see our athletes every day. So, if a guy thinks that a practice was really hard, or, if a guy's starting to get worn down, if there are fatigue and soreness elements, we can start to dig into those things through subjective wellness questionnaire, but also, and more importantly and more consistently, just through conversations with the athletes and getting to know, their demeanor and how they walk into the building on a certain day. What's their mood like? What's their presentation like? How are they moving? Do they look stiff, a little more hesitant, a little slower to get going? All of those things are really valuable responses to what they've gone through the day before, the hours before, and in some days, the several days or weeks before. So that would be kind of my hierarchy of data collection is, get the external workloads first, layer in the internal physiological workloads if possible, and then that third layer would be the subjective or the perceived.
I like that layered approach. Regarding these external workloads and measures and GPS and Catapult, are there certain metrics that you place more value on? And I'm going to quote you on your article here, and I highlighted it. It was brilliant. Further, and you're talking now, distance-based workload measures likely underestimate outputs associated with short duration burst and direction changes, collisions, and high-intensity movements like shootings. And you quoted Cummings et al. I looked at a lot of the workload literature. I counted 7 articles, and maybe there's more since I looked first, but I looked at these several with Catapult, several time motion analysis, which are different tools for measure. And I looked at these quote unquote total distances traveled. You're looking at roughly 4,400 meters plus a game, which is approximately 2.7 miles. The distance-based measures, could you go, it seems as though those measures for you would be more dictated towards speed, bursts, high-intensity efforts, as opposed to just looking at, and I'm guessing you're giving me this running analogy that you just gave me, right? It's very similar.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that are worth commenting on. The first is that the GPS technology does not accurately measure really short distance bursts and changes of direction. So that creates a real challenge if that's all you're using is distance-based measures. I think that's one of the things that makes the catapult technology that will layer in, and they're not the only ones, but that will layer in GPS data with accelerometer data. They have the triaxial accelerometer, the magnemometer, and the gyroscope, so they can collect data on what the athlete, and it's on the athlete, so they can collect data that maybe GPS would miss because it is such short distance or short amplitude type movements. Okay. You could, I've explained in the past that if you stood still and just vertical jumped as high as you possibly could for a minute, that would be extremely taxing. Your GPS distance traveled would be 0 meters. So there are limitations to looking at things from all aspects. I think the collision and contact point is a good one because, when you're in the corner and you're battling, you're not moving anywhere, but you're in, a Greco-Roman wrestling match there where you might be leaning into a guy and pushing as hard as you can, but you're not traveling anywhere. So that's not to say that distance-based measured, speeds reached, time spent in different speed zones, that all of those things aren't valuable. I think they're extremely valuable, but but you're going to have a blind spot then to the metabolic cost and the neuromuscular cost of some of those more stationary or shorter distance type movements. In hockey, distance-based measures are even more challenging to interpret because you can glide on the ice, which you can't, there's a more defined mechanical cost to running certain distances than there are to skating certain distances. And, it doesn't mean that gliding is free. There's a cost to that too, especially if you're kind of in a ready stance and, your hips and knees are flexed and you're in a position to be able to burst out of that position. I think, even though you're gliding and you're not actively skating, you're still in a squat hold position for some of that. So there's a cost to that too, which is a little harder to define in the moment. So looping back to your question of, are there measures that I place more value in? I think with the PhD project early on, we tried to use categories that philosophically made sense that they could have some impact on the game itself. So, we look at volume-based measures of total work, like player load through Catapult. Then they have Catapult has an algorithm to detect skating strides, which allows you to calculate a total volume of skating. So those were two things that were just total volume outputs of work in general and skating load. Then there were more intensity-based measures. So they have a measure explosive efforts, which is basically a frequency count of all measures that exceed a certain acceleration threshold.
Is that one of the, like a speed band that you'd pass? Is that what you mean by explosive efforts? Like there's bands of speed based on velocity?
Yes, but it's based on acceleration. It's based on the accelerometer measure, not based on speed bands.
Gotcha.
And then high force strides is a very similar concept. That's a frequency count of the skating strides that occur above a certain skating load threshold. So that then allows us to look at the same concept: total volume of high intensity work, total skating volume of total high intensity skating volume. Then there are work rate measures. So, what are player loads per minute? What are skating loads per minute? And then the last one was just the average force per stride output. So, are there any changes there? And all of those measures are defensible in my mind. You're looking at total volume of work, total volume of skating, total high intensity volume of work, total high intensity skating volume, total work rate, total skating work rate, and then, average force output per stride over the course of a fairly long period of time. And, in that first paper, the big take home, which is, a lot of analysis to have a fairly simple conclusion, is that forwards, at least in that population, had significantly higher values across all practice types, which we looked at a day before a game, 2 days before a game, 3 days before a game, or 4 or more days before a game. Forwards had higher workloads in all, or higher measures in across all of those metrics, across all of those session types, including games. And, I think that as my philosophy on the training process has evolved over time, you kind of start with what's the best hockey specific program that I can write that's going to prepare hockey players for the demands of the game. And then you kind of layer in injury history and then some of these different assessment methods and what your findings are there. And, I think that that position is clearly one that warrants some attention, because what forwards are being asked to do and what defensemen are being asked to do, and certainly what goalies are being asked to do, are not the same thing on the ice. Yep. And depending on the system too, maybe what the centers and the wingers are being asked to do is not the same. Centers in certain systems maybe are more analogous to midfielders in soccer, that they're going to cover a ton of ground. So the way that you prepare them from a training standpoint needs to be different. I think I had an experience, and certainly not to relate my playing ability to the athletes that I work with now by any stretch, but I had an experience in college where I was moved. I was a forward heading into it, was moved back to play defense for a couple of years. And particularly my sophomore year in college, I would periodically play shifts back as a forward. And I remember thinking the first time that I had to play a shift as a forward after, being a defenseman for a year and change at that point, I was crushed after the shift. I was gassed. And, as a forward, you always just think like, if I'm tired after a shift, they're probably tired after a shift too. We were all out there together. It's fairly widely known that there's typically less defensive pairs than forward lines. So defensemen are on the ice more in general than forwards are. So maybe it's more tiring. And it's, at least in my experience, it was wildly different playing as a defenseman than it was as a forward. So, circling back to that first paper, I think that the intensity that forwards are required to play at leads to higher cumulative measures in some cases, depending on what the measure is. They might not cover as much distance because they're not on the ice as much, but the amount of work that they're doing is higher. So, that was kind of, that was paper one. I think we ran something like 54 Manovas and Mankovas, and
it was a large method section.
These forwards work pretty hard out there. So, maybe there's a discussion that we need to have in the preparation process to change some things.
Let me ask you, from an application standpoint, I realize a totally different data set, but for those, who might not have a GPS system, the takeaways from this, would you manipulate training volume based on position during the in-season? I know it all depends on playing time, but again, would there be direct application in season for modifications based on your thoughts of this paper?
Yeah, I think there are. Again, some of it's system based. Everything for me is individual based. So
sure,
you can start to create these profiles based on the position and the role in the team in your head, and then first line center versus fourth line center. The shift length is going to be different. The amount of total ice time is going to be different. What's being asked of them is going to be different. How you prepare them then might be different. Those fourth line guys, if you're playing 8 to 12 minutes a night, you might be able to train them a little bit more like sprinters, like make sure that their output is maximal, and they might go sit on the bench for 8 to 15 minutes in real time before they go back out again. So that's certainly not the case everywhere. And, you string together a couple penalty kills and it looks a little different for them, but you may be able to start from there. Yep. And then look at some of these worst case scenario situations and prepare them for those as well, versus first line center that's on the ice for, 18 to 22 minutes a night. It's going to be maybe penalty killing and on the power play, maybe in line to double shift if somebody were to go down with an injury or something along those lines, that, maybe the high intensity aerobic work for a player like that is that much more important because they're
Got it.
their total volume of work is going to be higher, and they need to keep their pace high in order to be effective. So that's kind of where I start is,
Yep.
what is this profile of the role that's being asked of this player? And then where are they at now? So, if we want to train somebody like a sprinter and they're more like a plow horse, strong but slow, then definitely in season, you can start to look at integrating more speed and power work for that player. And that can be on the ice and off the ice. If a player is exceptionally gifted in their speed and power abilities and is in that first line role, maybe we need to spend more time strategically building in aerobic work to help support them recovering from those high output bursts faster and to make their work outputs more sustainable over the course of a shift, over the course of a game, and over the course of a season. We see the guys that kind of roll out of bed and have 32-inch, 34-inch vertical jumps with, those guys struggle sometimes if they're up and down the ice with their output. It's a 12-cylinder engine, which, those go fast, but they also use more gas. So how can we help them develop a larger gas tank so that they can not have the drop off that their physiology is requiring based on where they're starting at? So that's kind of the next step to me is, here's the vision for where they need to be. Here's where they're starting. How can we start to bridge that gap? And then this is one of the other things that has been a learning process for me at this level is we've seen players go from out of the lineup, from healthy scratch, to playing on the first line 2 weeks later, to being a fourth liner the next week. So, in the back of your head, you constantly have to consider if this player is going to shift up in the lineup, we need to make sure that they're also prepared to take that step. Because if we're too myopic on this player's in this role and that's all they're ever going to be, then if they are asked to move from fourth line wing to second line wing, and they go from playing 10 minutes a night to 17 minutes a night, and they don't feel good towards the end of a game, that's on us, because we haven't prepared them to slide up in the lineup and to sustain whatever it is that they bring to the table consistently over the course of the game based on what's being asked of them from the staff.
That's a very good point. I want to parlay it. You also wrote an article, this is from your PhD research, Impact of Preceding Workload on Team Performance in Collegiate Men's Hockey. You collected rolling sums of player load, different metrics, explosive efforts, high frequency strides or high force strides, and you had rollovers, 3-day, 5-day, 7-day, 20-day, 28-day. So acute to chronic. What were your findings? Again, these were collegiate hockey players. What were your aha moments during that research and the results that you garnered from it?
The first aha moment is that if I could do it all again, I would work with a statistician out of the gate. That might save me. I should have invested in Excedrin before I started that process. But I think there's, at the time when I first started going down that road from a project standpoint, the acute to chronic workload monitoring and the proposed relationship with injury risk was really gaining momentum as a presentation of data tool, and the link with injury risk was being widely discussed and integrated into a lot of sports science programs across sports and across levels. And, I think reading through some of that literature, there's a lot of really significant challenges in identifying injury. What does that mean? Because if it's just a player not participating, then some of it is based on what the player is willing to play through, what the medical staff is willing to clear somebody to play through. Is somebody available, but available knowing that they're not going to play? That's a different situation than, maybe making a top six forward available. And that if they're available, they're definitely going to be put in the lineup. So, I think there was a lot of nuance in how that literature should be interpreted, I think. And there was also a lot of different papers used different measures of work. Some were using training load based off of RPE times session duration. Some were using different GPS-based metrics. Some were using things like pitch counts or bowling counts in cricket. So some were more event frequency counts. People were, one paper looked at different running speeds and intensities and used different acute time periods and different chronic time periods. And, I left all of that thinking there's a lot of different ways to analyze this data. And in hockey at the time, there were 0 papers. So instead of saying, I'm going to take a 7-day time period and a 28-day time period, because that was the bulk of the emerging literature, I wanted to take the approach of, if you look at what the player had done in the previous day, that might have a short-term impact on what they're able to do the next day. Is that fair?
Yeah.
If you look at what they do over the preceding 3 days, that could have a short-term cumulative fatigue effect on and preparedness effect on what they're able to do on day 4. Same thing 5 days, same thing 7-day. And with the 5-day versus 7-day kind of acute time period workloads, you're also then teasing out just a practice week typically versus a practice week and including games. So, we cast a wide net to try to discern some of those differences where, what does it mean if a player's 7-day workload is typical for them, but the day before they had a really high output? Going into it, there's a reason to believe that could affect what they do that weekend.
Sure.
The opposite is also true. If they have a really easy day before, but they did a lot in the preceding week, maybe that deload on the day before isn't enough to allow them to recover to then prepare or perform in the weekend up to their ability. So I went into it trying to look at things from a lot of different vantage points to start to wrap my head around what, if any, of those things actually have an impact on team performance. And team performance in itself it's a difficult thing to measure. I think it's easy to say it should be measured on wins and losses, but anybody that's been around the game for long enough knows that there are times throughout the year where you significantly outperform the opposing team and lose. And, maybe you hit a hot goalie, maybe, broken sticks on empty net shots. There's a lot that can kind of play into whether the final score outcome is what you would expect based on the way the game unfolded. And the opposite's also true. You might not play well and still win the game. So in college, there's not as much data based on game performance as there is in professional sports. So one thing that was available is shots for and shots against, which as a proxy for performance is not perfect, but it's reasonable. I think in general, if you outshoot teams consistently, you're likely to score more goals than they are. So we use that as our team performance measure, was the shot differential between the participant team and the opposing team. And then we also tried to control for the ranking difference between the participant team and the opposing team. If you're the second ranked team in the country and you're playing an unranked team, you should outshoot them. Yeah. So we tried to account for those things. And, maybe similar to the first paper, there was a lot of analysis that went into it. And the outcome of that was that the only thing that really had a substantial impact on team performance was the 7-day high force stride volume preceding the game. And basically we looked at that again, kind of trying to loop this into the emerging work of this acute to chronic workload ratio management. They typically frame things as, low, typical, and high, and very high. But if we just look at it kind of within that confine of, is this typical? Is this low? Is this high? We were looking at some of those cumulative measures broken up by quartile, meaning, slightly below average or slightly below the median line, way below, slightly above, way above. And basically what we found is that if the team was in the third quartile of high force strides, they significantly outshot their opponents. And the most crippling state to be in was the first quartile. So, to me, that is whether you have access to Catapult or any other external workload monitoring technology for on ice work or not, that is consistent with some literature in other sports as well, that high intensity exposure heading into competitions matters. And how you measure that and how you integrate that into your workflow is going to be very situation dependent. But in that case, that 7-day window mattered, where the 1, 3, and 5 did not. So I think that from a practical standpoint allows you to look at a time period with a little more flexibility than saying, 2 days out from a game, we have to do this. Now it's, what if practices look like the week before a game? Or, how many games have we played in a week? If you're in a professional setting where it could be 5 in some cases, it could be 2 in others. And do we have a reason to believe that all the players have been sufficiently exposed to high intensity work in that time window? And if the answer is no, then finding opportunities to build in some additional work in that area can be really important for players. And, the opposite is also true. If certainly too low is a detriment to team performance based on those findings, but way too high is also very likely a detriment to team performance. So finding that sweet spot based on all of the other things that we had discussed before, the player presentation, what they've done from a game standpoint, what their time on ice looks like, which is basically tracked at all levels of hockey, or certainly could be at some of the youth levels as well. Yeah. How is the athlete presenting? Are they sore? Are they tired? Are they stiff? Are there reasons to believe that exposure to additional high intensity work on a given day would not be appropriate or not? And then if it is, then, find a way to build that into what they're doing, ideally on the ice, and if not off the ice. And if that can be integrated into drill selection, finding ways to integrate drills where players are getting up and down the ice with some pace and tempo, but then also building in some rest so that the quality stays high, great. If it needs to be as simple as line up on the goal line and sprint as hard as you can through the blue line a few times to make sure that there's that exposure, then I think that works too. And in some cases may be equally desirable, because then the focus is strictly on output. There's not the elements of needing to read the play and adjust to the speed of other players. And, if you're carrying the puck or about to receive the puck or defending a puck, your pace is just based off maximal intent, opposed to all those other situational factors, which definitely need to be addressed throughout the preparatory process, sure, but maybe not in isolated examples where you're just trying to give the player exposure to maximum output work.
Fantastic answer. Talk to the listeners about resources that you've offered, both DVDs and books, and your website and your social media handles. And I ask that because there's such great information on them all. So could you please share that with the listeners?
Sure. I appreciate that. A few years ago wrote a book called Speed Training for Hockey with a co-author Travis Pollen. The intent there was really to simplify the speed training process, to show all the elements that can be used to influence speed in hockey, and then to develop a template of a speed training program for the offseason that is digestible for the masses. So there's certainly an integration of scientific principle, but it's not written as a PhD level biomechanics and physiology text by any stretch. So if people are interested in speed training for hockey, whether you're a hockey parent, youth hockey coach, or, somebody that's competing at higher levels, I think there's some value there. The other thing that I would direct, what I anticipate the audience of your podcast being, I would direct them to optimizing-adaptation.com, which is a seminar that I did with Mike Potenza, who, we mentioned earlier is now, I think you're right. I think it's year 17. He's the director of strength and conditioning with the San Jose Sharks. And then James Laval, who has an incredible resume that I won't attempt to outline here, but that seminar series covers, performance profiling, how to use testing to drive program design. It includes workload monitoring, reporting to coaches and recovery information, reconditioning injured athletes, and then James's in-season training. And then James does a ton of information on nutrition and supplementation and how that can be used to support the training process and to support performance. So I'd encourage people to look at those if they're interested. From a social media standpoint, I'm probably most active on Twitter. My handle there is just @KevinNeeld. And then I have a website, kevinneeld.com, that is all free content if people are interested in learning more based on any of the things we talked about today. And then my email address is just ken@kevinneeld.com. If anybody wants to shoot me a note, I'm happy to talk through anything we talked about today or just establish a dialogue. I have certainly learned a lot from you. And obviously I've mentioned in the past, I think, I learned more from your Instagram account than I had from some college courses. So appreciate everything you do. And, obviously the listeners and some of the other people that you've had on here already have been great resources for me. So happy to connect with anybody that wants to reach out.
Our guest today has been Kevin Neeld. Kev, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.